everyone, this is Lomi, and today I'll be showing you how to make a pattern for a cape or hooded cloak for your dolls. This can be done for any doll because we'll be working off of measurements. I know, nobody likes math. We'll begin by taking just a few measurements. I'll be taking measurements on Lulu, my little fee, because she's what I have out right now, but the cape I'm making is actually for all. The first thing you'll do is get the length measurement, which should be from the nape of the doll's neck down to wherever you want the cape to end. It's important to go down the back of the doll instead of the front because if you're working with a female doll, there are some things that might get in the way of an accurate measurement. But once you run the measuring tape down the doll's back, you can make the cape as long or as short as you want. The next measurement you'll want to get is around the doll's neck. You don't want the measuring tape to be flat all the way against the doll's neck. You'll want it to be a little bit bigger, especially if your doll is going to be wearing clothing underneath. Having a little bit of a gap around the neckline makes it lay more realistically. If all you want to make is a cape, then those are the only two measurements you need. But if you want to make a hood, you'll need two more. To determine how tall your hood needs to be, you'll need to measure up from the doll's collarbone around to the top of the head. If you're working for a fantasy doll that has big shaped ears like my elves, you'll want to make sure that the measuring tape goes up and over the ears so that the hood will fit over them too. It's so hard to measure Lulu, her head is so kicky. After I get to the new house, I think I'm finally going to suede her. That point at the very top center of the head is the height measurement for the hood. The second measurement you'll need for the hood will be from the front of the face. You don't have to wrap this around the doll's head, you just want it to be level with their profile. Then you wrap it around to the middle of the back of the head. This shows you how deep the hood needs to be to pull all the way forward around their head. You can't really convert human-sized patterns with hoods for dolls because dolls have enormous heads proportionally. Now that we have the measurements, it's time for the math. Before you start your calculations, you need to decide how full of a cloak you want to make. Mine is going to be 3/4 of a circle. You have to ensure that the hood will fit inside the neckline of the cloak. So we need to make sure that we know the radius that the opening will need to be. For Faral's cloak, which is going to be a 3/4 circle, I want the neckline to be 6 inches around. This means the cloak will fit comfortably around her shoulders and leave plenty of room for collars on her dresses. Since her cloak will only be 3/4 of a circle, I first need to find the full size of the circle to make sure that I have the right measurements. I'll divide the neck measurement by 3, since it's 3/4, and then I'll multiply that number by 4. This shows me what a full-size circle would be. We divide this measurement by pi, 3.14, to determine the diameter of the circle. To find the radius, we will then divide the diameter by half. That means the radius I'll need to mark on the pattern will be 1.27 inches. If you're making a full circle cloak instead, then you would just find the radius of the original neck measurement. And if you were making a half circle cloak, you would multiply your neck measurement by 2 and then find the radius of that. Fortunately, we are done with the difficult math now. Everything from here on will be a little bit easier, so let's start drafting the pattern. Here I'm set up on my kitchen table because it was the only area big enough for me to work. I have my measurements written down on the edge of the paper. I'll start by making one line down the side of the paper. The pattern will begin in a corner. So I'll turn my yardstick, level up the end of it, and then draw another line perpendicular to that one. I'll be drawing my pattern on a piece of Swedish tracing paper. I love this for pattern making. This is probably the last pattern that I'm going to draft in this house. Now we'll mark our measurements down one side of the pattern. We'll start in the top corner. I'll mark that radius that I found originally, 1.27. Next, to make it easier to draw the really big circle of the cloak, I'm going to add a guideline in the middle. I start by putting my ruler against these 2 dots that I just put on these lines. I'll need to put another mark right in between them, in the very middle. I see that the measurement is 1 3/4 of an inch. So I'll put the dot in the middle, which would be 7/8 of an inch. Fortunately, I think that's the last of the math I need to use here. On this line, I'll also mark the radius measurement. This will help me make a uniform circle for the neck opening. You can freehand your circle this way, or if you have one, you can use one of these fancy curved rulers. I have a couple, so I try a few until I find one that lines up well with the dots I have marked. Now I'll extend this line down the rest of the paper, so that I can use it to round out the bottom of the cloak as well. Now we'll mark the length of the cloak. This is done by measuring down from that curved line we just created, which is the neckline. For my doll, it's going to be 22 inches down from there. I mark that on each of the 3 lines. In order to make my curve on the bottom edge more consistent, I add more of those guidelines. This is done the same way as that first one that was right in the middle. I divide the measurement between the 2 lines, put a dot right in the middle, and then extend that all the way down to the bottom edge. It's okay if these aren't perfectly straight or exactly the right size. You'll see that some of mine are a little bit wider or more narrow than the others, but they'll help me make the bottom really even. I mark the 22-inch point on every single one of these lines. After they're all marked, I can go back and use a ruler to connect them, which will give me a mostly rounded shape. Or you can use a French curve, like I'm going to do. Another neat idea would be to make each one of these sections shaped, maybe scalloped, or maybe cut them into points, so that the bottom edge of your cloak would have a really interesting shape. I'll just make mine round though. I continue this curve around halfway across the pattern. Then I'm going to cut this big piece of material loose so that I can move it around more easily as I refine the pattern. Depending on the size of the piece of material you'll be sewing with, you may not need to do this step. But I only have 1 yard of fabric, so I'll need to cut 3 separate pieces and then sew them back together to recreate the circle. Depending on how big your doll is, this might not be necessary. But since I'll be sewing the pieces back together, I need to add a seam allowance to the edges. You'll want to add a seam allowance to the neckline no matter what, because this is where you're going to sew on your hood. If you're just going to be tracing your pattern straight onto the material and cut it out as one big circle, then you always have the option of just freehanding a seam allowance at the end. I'm kind of forgetful though, especially with everything I have going on right now, so just to protect myself, I'm going to mark those seam allowances in there. It'll be easy for me to tell from the 1/4 inch edge that goes all the way around the pattern that I already have a seam allowance on this. I'll cut out these 2 straight edges. You'll notice that I haven't finished the bottom curve yet. That's because before I make the curve, I want to take a second to fold the pattern on itself and do what we call truing up a pattern. This lets me check to make sure that everything is overlapping the way I want and that it's a uniform curve. I mark a seam allowance on the bottom so that I can hem the material, and then I cut it out. Once I cut off the top curve, then the cape part of the pattern is pretty much done. There's a little crooked piece at the bottom where I managed to cut a little too much material off, so my seam allowance looks a little bit weird and uneven there. Fortunately, that's something I can easily freehand cut around. If all you're making is a cape, then you're ready to go ahead and sew. But I'm still making a hood for mine, so now I'll show you how to do that. We start the hood the same way, by putting 2 perpendicular lines on the paper. At some point, I really want to get a square ruler. I think it would save me a lot of time. Now we'll measure down this side line, and mark the number that was the measurement from your doll's collarbone to the top of their head. For all, that was 6.5 inches. We're going to square up that line as well. Along this bottom edge, this is what's going to attach to the collar of the cape. So, measuring out from the sideline, we'll mark 1/2 of the neck measurement. Faral's neck measurement was 6 inches, if you'll remember, so that means I'll mark 3 inches out here. That's because the hood is 2 halves. Since I use a French curve for a lot of my pattern drafting, for hoods like this, I usually just skip right to the part where I curve out the back. You can freehand it if you don't have a curved ruler like mine. It doesn't really need to be precise. The only thing you want to check here is making sure that the widest point of the curve matches the depth of your doll's face. This was the measurement we got when we held the measuring tape parallel to their profile and wrapped it around to the middle back of their head. For all, that measurement was 4 inches, and I'm not going to measure this because I can tell just by looking at it that it already clears that measurement. So here's 1/2 of the hood. Of course, if you don't want to mess with making a curve, you can also make a more fantasy-looking pointed hood. You would do this just by angling a ruler up to the top line from that neck measurement that we marked earlier. The point can be as shallow or as deep as you want, as long as you make sure that it clears that head depth measurement. And last of all, to finish the hood, I will add a seam allowance. This is 1/4 of an inch all the way around because I like working with really tiny hems for dolls. If you need a bigger seam allowance, you're free to add however big of one that you need. Just be aware that when you're working in doll scale, a bigger seam allowance means much more bulk. Honestly, I think cloaks are one of my favorite fantasy outfit staples. I really want to make capes and cloaks for all of my dolls, and I'm not sure why I've never done it. I guess it's just because it takes a lot of fabric. But in the books, I'm always writing about the characters having these different cloaks and capes and things. Rune and Faral come from a tropical island where there's a lot of rain, so cloaks are pretty much a staple. Oiled cloaks are very useful for keeping off the rain. Once my seam allowance is marked, I go ahead and cut out the hood. You'll probably want to label your pattern pieces too. I'm bad about forgetting to do that. I'm trying to get better as time goes on. Once all my pattern pieces are cut out, I spread out my material on the living room floor and get to work. Unfortunately, I'm in the middle of packing up my workshop, so there was no room for me to lay everything out in there. For really big pieces like this, I like to use my rotary cutter and self-healing mat for cutting them out. And there are other reasons for wanting to avoid working outside of my workshop too. Ugh. Dog kisses. At least she's sweet. I hope she handles the move well. We've lived in this house that dog's whole life. The material you make your cloak out of is up to you. I personally really like the way that crushed velvet lays. It might be a little bit fantasy cliche, but that's okay as long as I get that nice drape. Once I cut out my 3 cape pieces and my 2 hood pieces, then I'm ready to move on to sewing. If I can find it, I may give this cloak a lining, but I'll have to see where my other fabric is first. Everything's kind of in a state of disarray right now, but at least we're making progress. So that's it for making the pattern. It's pretty simple to sew, but just in case you need it, I'll be back next week with instructions on how to put the pattern together. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.